All right, now to discuss more on the Russian elections, the voting for which is presently underway, we are joined in by Mr. Arun Singh, who is a former ambassador to the United Nations. Thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us. And also we are joined by Dmitry Babbage, who is a political analyst. He's from the Russian international news agency Sputnik, who's joining us from Moscow. Now, Dmitry Babbage, let me begin with you. Now, this, of course, is a big day in Russia. Give us a sense of what's actually playing out today in Russia. Almost about 106 million voters will be casting their vote. They're expected to cast their vote. And Vladimir Putin is expected to come back with a thumping landslide of a majority.
Well, I think that a lot is at stake because this time there is at least one serious candidate challenging Putin. That is the candidate of the Communist Party, Pavel Grudinin. He is a successful businessman, but he has the support of the Communist Party, which is the second largest party in the country,
right,
with its own media, its own regional organizations. And Grudinin is challenging Putin on internal policy. So a lot of people will vote for Grudinin not because they like Pavel Grudinin as a person, and not because they dislike Putin as a person, but because they want to send a message to Putin that the economic policy is too liberal, too pro-Western, too globalist. So this is one of the themes of this election, which I think is the most important one. As far as the foreign policy is concerned, people support Putin wholeheartedly. And I would say that the United States and the European Union, when they pressured Russia so hardly during the Olympic Games, during the situation in Syria, in Ukraine, they helped Putin to become more popular because under pressure, Russians mobilize themselves, and there is a kind of consensus in society that Russia is being treated unfairly by the West, and that kind of consolidates the voters around Putin.
Absolutely. You know, it's an interesting couple of points that you've raised, that there is perhaps this gentleman, Pavel Grudinin, who may put up some sort of a credible opposition to Vladimir Putin. We'll get to know the results by the end of this day. But Ambassador Singh, let me bring you in on this. You know, Vladimir Putin has been in power in Russia for the last 18 years. He's remained virtually unchallenged. Why is that?
I think he's remained unchallenged because, as recent reports also indicate, a lot of people in Russia support him. And in fact, the younger generation, many of whom would be voting for the first time, support him. Because they see him as restoring or working to restore Russia's pride, working to restore Russia's role internationally. And as Dmitry commented, there is some concern in Russia on the economic situation. And that is also attributed to the fact that there have been sanctions now on Russia. So Russia is dealing with those challenges. But at the same time, Putin has worked to expand Russian influence and push back on Western attempts to push Russia. For example, in Georgia, he worked to, from their point of view, protect Russia's interests. In Ukraine, he worked to protect Russia's interests. And if you look at Syria, despite playing from a weaker hand, Russia has become a very important player in what is happening in Syria and what would be a post-conflict resolution of the situation. So people see him as consolidating the system in Russia and working to expand Russia's role, and so they support him.
Expanding Russia's role in the larger world and somehow pulling Russia out of the chaos which it found itself in after the dissolution of the Soviet era. Dmitry, you know, a lot of people are looking at this election and they are wondering, is it domestic issues which will actually determine as to which way the Russian electorate will vote, or is it have, you know, Vladimir Putin has, you know, in some ways muscled his way to bring Russia back to a certain preeminence that it enjoyed during the Soviet era? Is it Putin's foreign policy, or is it his domestic policy that's in fact going to be tested in this vote today in Russia?
Well, I think Putin's strong point is his foreign policy, but the events of the last few years were so dramatic that there is no clear distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy. Take the situation in Ukraine. Ukraine is a nation of 46 million people who lived with us in the same country. You know, you can't tell a Russian from Ukrainian in most of the cases because both nations speak either Russian or a language very close to Russian. You know, Ukrainian to Russian is like Urdu and Hindi. It's very, very close languages. So when Ukraine under the new regime became a hostile country, you know, when the new regime in Ukraine air flights from Russia, now they threaten to stop the railway connection. It's a tragedy for Russians, like separation of Muslim India and Hindu India after the colonial rule ended in 1947, because there are tens of millions of people who have relatives in both Ukraine and Russia. So when Putin stood up to this new regime in Kiev, when he refused to bow to its pressure and let things be as they are in eastern Ukraine, that of course made him popular, even though there are many people who say he didn't do enough to prevent the fascists coming to power in Kiev. In the same way with, for example, sports, you know, Russia's participation in the Olympic Games. Formally, it's an international affair, but when the Russian team was not allowed to show its national colors, when our athletes could not even call themselves Russian team, they had to call themselves Olympic athletes from Russia, people got a feeling that this is what our life is going to be if we bow to the West, if we meet all of their demands. We will become a kind of a colony without even our national colors. So, in a sense, foreign policy and domestic policy are no longer separated in Russia as they used to be separated in the past. And Putin is a master of foreign policy, but a lot of people are questioning, can you maintain an independent foreign policy when you still keep your economy open to international financial institutions, to the international system of computer control over banking transactions? All of these are huge issues which were discussed during this campaign. So I think the campaign was useful because of the themes that were raised.
Absolutely, indeed. You know, that's an interesting point that you've raised, Dmitry. Let me take that across to Ambassador, saying, you know, Ambassador, every time there is a sort of a confrontation or a standoff with the West, which Russia has, it somehow appears that Putin's hand actually strengthens within his own country. Now, the diplomatic row that we've seen playing out in Britain because of what has happened with the poisoning of the double agent, you know, Sergei Skripal, that is clearly playing out in favor of Vladimir Putin. And apart from that, America has also chosen to impose sanctions for what it says was Russian alleged meddling in the presidential campaign of the year 2016. And that again is something which Vladimir Putin has used it to his own advantage.
So there was a sense in Russia that after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990, the West saw itself as a victor in the Cold War, and Russia is vanquished, and worked step by step to push Russia. So first there was a NATO expansion to the east, including to countries that were part of the former Soviet Union, and that didn't go down well in Russia. Then there was an expansion of the European Union to the east. And so, for example, when they saw an attempt like that being made in the context of Ukraine, and Dmitry just referred to how important Ukraine is in the Russian psyche. And I was present in Moscow in 1997, when the new government in Russia worked out the arrangement with the new country of Ukraine. And at that time, the whole issue of Crimea was very, very emotional. So many Russians spiritually, symbolically, emotionally felt that Crimea was somehow linked to Russia. And therefore what happened in Crimea in the context of Russia and Ukraine is to one level not surprising, despite its international consequences. You know, it's interesting
that it's almost exactly 4 years. It's the 4th year anniversary of the annexation of Crimea on which these elections are being held. Do you think that's deliberate?
No, no. I think just a coincidence.
It's a coincidence?
But to one point that Dmitry made about Russia being integrated or having some linkages with international institutions, if you take the example of China, the Chinese economy is heavily integrated with the global economy. And Chinese economy is heavily integrated with international investment and financial flows. And yet China is working to establish its own independence in foreign policy. Therefore, a linkage with global flows and institutions doesn't necessarily mean that your foreign policy stances would be compromised. So there, to some extent, I would
absolutely, indeed. And also, Dmitry, you know, one of the interesting things which a lot of people are in fact looking at the elections in Russia is that of the rise of the candidate Ksenia Sobchak. She's seen as a sort of a political outsider. Talk to us a bit about how she's perceived in Russia.
Well, I mean, the good thing about this election is that all the major ideologies present in today's society were reflected in the choice of candidates that we had. We had 8 candidates, each of them represented a certain ideology. Ksenia Sobchak represents the ideology of so-called liberalism or neoliberalism, which is like meeting all the demands of the West, you know, introducing same-sex marriage, feminist solutions for all the problems, quotas. She also advocated a return of Crimea to Ukraine, but she got in this situation because she went to campaign in Crimea because Crimea has 2 million voters. So before going there, she asked for the permission of the Ukrainian regime in Kiev to go. And they said no. That was, you know, the first part of it, because she was their advocate.
Right.
She wanted to kind of campaign in favor of the new Ukrainian regime in Russia. She kindly asked them to allow to go to Crimea, which they no longer control. It's under Russian control. And they were to allow and to call her names.
Okay. All right.
So basically, I think the previous speaker is right about the need for Russia to keep kind of connected to the international economy, not to repeat the mistakes, the isolationist mistakes of the Soviet Union. But you have to strike some kind of a balance here, because it is clear that the United States and the European Union, in their current attitude towards Russia, you can expect anything from them. See? So during this election, this was really discussed because one of the candidates, Maxim Suraikin, who represents like not a kind of moderate communists like Mr. Grudinin, but the radical communists. He said that we just need to disconnect from the international networks because, you know, they can be dangerous for Russia. So this point of view was also represented and people could vote for it. But I think the majority voted for Putin because Putin's strategy is kind of, strangely, it's kind of conservative, you know, to withstand pressure without pulling out of international economy, without pulling out of international sports life, cultural life. And that view is popular with the majority of Russians because we lived through a very radical century, you know, the 20th century. Strangely, most people became very cautious and very moderate in their. They don't want experiments.
Absolutely, indeed. And also, Dmitry, just before I let you go, you know, we've seen what has happened in China, where Xi Jinping, through a sort of a constitutional amendment, has virtually given himself a chance to rule for his entire life if he wants. Vladimir Putin has been the leader of Russia for the last 18 years. If he were to win the election today, as he's expected, he would be ruling for the next, 6 years. So that'll be about 24 years. How long would Russia like to be under Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think that Putin will not rule, when he's an old man. He will not rule beyond this period, because we already see how he is replacing his friends, which had been with him until last year, since the start of his rule in the year 2000. He is replacing them with young technocrats. A lot of them, obviously, liberals, which is another kind of theme for concern in Russia. But I think he is very realistic. He understands physical limitations of individual humans, and I don't think he will cling to power. The same story in China. If you look at the Chinese press, they were very angry, when the Western press started saying that Xi Jinping is going to be the leader for life. that his choice is forever. The Chinese officials have stressed that, yes, they extended his term in power, but no one made him a president for life. Okay. And I think Xi Jinping, just like Putin, is after all a representative of the Chinese elite, just like Putin is a representative of the Russian elite. These people are practical. Okay. They based from very modest origins, a lot of them. They will allow themselves to be kind of put in danger simply having old and incapable people in power.
Absolutely. Interesting assessment there, Dmitry. And also last word to Ambassador saying, this is an interesting time at which Russia sees itself in a very important election in Russia. But, it's almost a foregone conclusion that Vladimir Putin will, of course, come back. How do you think this will play out for Russia as such? If you could give us a concluding words on this.
So I think from Russia's point of view, it will play out well because it will argue for stability. And of course, there would be Western commentators who would be criticizing that's not a fully free and fair election. It should be done in a different way. But from Russia's point of view, they would argue that people came out, they voted, they expressed support for the President Putin, and therefore he has legitimacy to that extent. And so long he has the support of the people, the elite in that country, and he keeps the system consolidated and keeps striving for enhancing Russia's role in the world, I think he would get support within Russia. So from his point of view, that argues for stability and progress in Russia and sufficient legitimacy for him to...
that's an interesting way of putting it, enhancing Russia's role in the world and actually bringing about a sense of stability in the chaos which Russia found itself after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I thank both my guests, Ambassador Singh and also to Dmitry Babish, who had joined us from Moscow.